spent a considerable amount of my life, my energy, time, attention, working really hard at being a people pleaser. I don't know if any of you have ever struggled with that same thing. Trying to please people is exhausting and it consumes a lot of energy because there's a couple of things that are true. Number one, you can't please everybody, right? You can't please anybody all the time. And so what ends up happening is while you're trying to please people, there are two people in particular that are not pleased. And the first one is yourself, right? I mean, you're trying to please everybody else. One of the things you can guarantee is that you won't be happy or pleased. But most importantly, who else is not pleased when you're trying to please people? God. So the two people that you never please, trying to please people, is yourself, and most importantly, you can never please God. In fact, that's why the Apostle Paul, when he was writing to the Galatian church, he said these words. He said, "Am I now trying to win the approval of men or of God? Or am I trying to please men?" He said, "If I were still trying to please men, I would not." Listen to these words. These are tough. If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. It's from Galatians 1:10. If you write that down. It's easy, I think, for us to get caught up in the approval game, where we work really hard to gain the approval of people. But it's really a pretty dangerous game to be playing with your life, isn't it? Because when you're trying to gain the approval of people, you're gaining the approval of the wrong person entirely. There's only one person that we should ever strive daily to gain the approval from. That's our Father in heaven. Here, He's the only one that matters. Because what Paul says is it's a really difficult truth. I cannot be a servant of Jesus Christ if I'm serving men to gain their approval. Jesus deals with this particular issue specifically in his first sermon, Sermon on the Mount. And the early parts of the book of the Gospel of Matthew shares Jesus' very first sermon that he gave while he just started into his ministry. And a little section of this, he's teaching on this particular issue of being people pleasers or being a God pleaser. So we're gonna get to listen in just a little bit this morning on Jesus' sermon, and of course this particular portion it extends into a broader portion of our lives, but specifically what we're going to deal with and talk about is his teaching on giving, because that's where we are over the next few weeks. We'll be talking about our courageous giving and what he has to say to us in this sermon. And this portion is incredibly important for us. So we're going to listen in. First, let's pray. And then in Matthew chapter 6, we'll start in verse 1 and see what Jesus has to say to even us today. So let's pray first. Father, thank you for the opportunity we have to listen in on one of Jesus' sermons. Give us ears to hear. Give us hearts that are open to not just listening, but then doing what he says for us to teach us. Give us the courage to follow. Jesus, in his holy, precious name we pray. Amen. All right, so the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, we're going to start in verse 1, where Jesus says, "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do," he says, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Now this is the beginning. We'll just stop here because this particular statement is the beginning of a little portion in his sermon where he gives 3 examples of what it looks like to try to please men instead of God. And we're just going to look at his very first example, which is, of course, about giving. Jesus starts off by telling us what not to do. He says the hypocrites give, the 3 examples, he says that the hypocrites give to the poor, they pray, and they fast, all for the sake of being seen by men for their own glory. Right? So Jesus says, don't be like that. So he's going to teach us what not to do, and then he's going to teach us what to do. So getting the praise of men, he says right here up front, is not a worthy reward. That's not the reward we should be wanting or striving for, because it's temporary. If we get this reward, this praise of men, the applause of men, if we get this, it's temporary, it's useless, and it means absolutely nothing to God. To have us, have man or people praise us, that means nothing to God. So what we need to do here, we need to be careful to, when we give, be careful to give in the right way, for the right reason, for the right reward. We have to be careful to give in the right way, for the right reason, for the right reward. Right? So let's explore what this looks like according to Jesus here in the next few verses. So let's pick up in verse 2 of chapter 6. He says here, so when you give to the needy, he says, don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, he says, they have received their reward in full. So first of all, just notice up front, he's not giving us an option here, right? About giving to the needy, giving to the poor. He says when you give, not if you give. He says when you give, it's not an if you have enough money to share with somebody else. It's not an if you have time or if you think about it or if somebody comes to you and they have a need and you can look in your checkbook and evaluate whether you've got it right now or if you have to wait or whatever. He just simply says when you give. It's not an if. This is not an option. This is a when statement. So he doesn't give us any kind of an out here. He says when you give. And that's really hard for us, isn't it? Because our natural reaction to any kind of thoughts of giving is to find out, do I have enough to give? The problem with that is nothing that I have is mine anyway, right? Everything in this whole world, everything of value, of worth, of wealth, actually belongs to God anyway. It's His, that He's entrusted to us for a particular purpose, for a particular amount of time. And so when a need arises, we're giving of what is God's anyway, not of what is ours. So there should never be any thought of, will I have enough to pay my bills? Will I have enough to... Because if I'm responsible with what God gives me anyway, I should never have any problems with that, right? So I've got to be responsible and let God teach me how to use what is His for His purpose and His glory in my life and in the lives of others. In fact, the early church, the first century church leaders taught a lot on this subject about giving and giving generously of what belongs to God to those who are in need. In fact, Paul commends, one of the purposes of his entire letter to the Philippian church was to just tell them, thank you for their generosity to him. He says, I didn't ask of you, but listen, you guys knew that I had need and you gave to me anyway. So he's commending them for their generosity. And then he's in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, he's talking to the Corinthian church about giving to the church in Jerusalem who had a tremendous need. And he was sharing with them about the Macedonian churches. And he is commending them because, listen, he says that they gave out of their extreme poverty and beyond their ability. It's amazing what God can do with what belongs to Him and how He can still provide for you when you give, when He says give. It's amazing what He does. And then John commands the church in his first letter, 1 John chapter 3, verse 17. Listen to these words carefully. He says, "But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him?" It says, "Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth." And then James, last one I'll share with you. There's so many more. You could just do your own study on this. But James says this: "Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, 'Hey, God bless you, brother. Go, I wish you well. Stay warm and well fed,' and send him on their way. And guess what? He says, what good? He says, if you don't do anything about their physical needs, what good is it?" So we give, right? I mean, that's who we are, as we were talking in Sunday school class, as the body of Jesus Christ, because that's who Jesus Christ is. That's what He did. He gave. And so we give without question. We give, right? That's who we are. So Jesus teaches us here in verse 2, he says, this is how you're not supposed to do it. This is how not to give in the right way, for the right reason, for the right reward. He says, don't blare, when you give, don't blare your own trumpets, or call attention to what you've done, right? Don't trumpet your own giving. You can just hear. I mean, they didn't literally blare trumpets. There's nothing in any writings or any reason to believe that they actually blared their own trumpets. When they gave, this is kind of metaphorical for what we trumpet our own cause. We trumpet our own giving. We trumpet ourselves. And remember back in verse 1, just a verse, when he started this teaching, he says, he talks about giving, about being seen by men. He uses a word here that we get, this seen by men. He uses a word where we get our word theatrical or theater, putting on this spectacular performance like we're on stage so people will notice us. So he says, don't give to the poor in such a way that you are giving a beautiful theatrical performance for people to notice. And that's what the word hypocrite is anyway, right? It is, back then, that was the word that we use for actor today. An actor on a stage was called a hypocrite. They would put on a mask to hide their true identity, and they would perform, and this, whatever it was, whatever they were acting out, whatever, what's the word I'm looking for? The person they were trying to portray. That's character. Thank you. So whatever character they were trying to portray, they were hiding behind, and so they weren't on the inside what they were on the outside. And in those masks were these megaphones so that people could hear. So essentially, what he's doing here is he's combining this idea of theatrical performance with an actor on the stage. You put it all together. What he says is, don't give as though you're putting on a performance for the attention and the applause of men. Jesus is brilliant in the way he puts stuff like that together. don't give as though you're putting on a performance to gain the attention, the applause of men. Now, I'll be honest, I struggle with something that the church will often do. Not necessarily our church, but I've seen it in churches all around the United States and even locally. I've known churches to promote their own benevolent activity, whether it's in news articles or interviews on the radio or TV. And here's the dilemma that I have, that I'm always caught with. I understand the good in that is as you promote what you do in your church, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's social media of various kinds, in the newspaper, whatever. When you promote it, what happens? People get to see the body of Christ at work, and they get to say, "Hey, I'd like to be a part of something like that." And I love what the church is doing. So in one way, you get to promote the church at work, and yet what Jesus is saying here is that there is something special about performing acts of love and kindness for only God to see. Isn't there something special about that? When we get to do something and not trumpet our own cause, and we do it so that only God can see it. Yeah. Jesus, when he'd heal somebody, he'd always tell them, almost always, hey, don't say anything about this. Don't tell anybody what I've just done for you. And they couldn't help it anyway, could they? The person that was healed always went off and told everybody out of the excitement and joy that they experienced from whatever Jesus just did for them. And they couldn't help but tell everybody about what Jesus did. I wonder then about our own good deeds. And when people applaud us, I wonder if that's all the reward we'll get. This earthly reward. But when we serve, and that person whom we serve shares about God's love that was done to them through us, how much better is that person's testimony about the goodness of God in the body of Christ than if we were to broadcast our own good deeds? I can remember back when I first started preaching in 1999, I was young, I was naive and inexperienced really, and when I preach and need to give an illustration, a story to tell, to illustrate a point, I always struggled because I only knew my experiences or my young family's experiences, so I'd share them. And as you know, most of the time in the positive light of my family, the good things that they did. And eventually I had an elder who loved me enough to come to me and say, "Hey, Doug, listen, we know how wonderful your family is." He said, "But let us tell those wonderful stories about your family to others." He said, start sharing about other people's wonderful good deeds. Share about them, and then they'll share about your family's good deeds. And that person, I appreciated his great advice. And I don't think my intentions about sharing about my family were wrong. But listen, perception will often trump reality, right? And when you trumpet your own cause, or toot your own horn, so to speak, then no one else is going to trumpet it for you. And most importantly, God remains silent. If you trumpet your own, God So now Jesus tells us here in verse 3 and following, he gives us the right way to give, for the right reasons, for the right reward. He says, don't trumpet your own cause. Now he says, this is what you should do. So here's what Jesus teaches. Look with me, verse 3 and 4. He says, but when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. So let me say this. Even if nobody else trumpets your good deeds when you serve in secret or in silence, God notices. That's hard, isn't it? I mean, when you do, and give, and nobody ever, maybe nobody says thank you, nobody ever promotes you, nobody promotes the church, nobody says good things about you, they just keep taking and taking and taking, and you just keep giving and giving and giving, and that's hard. I've had lots of people say, and I felt the same way, it's nice to get a thank you. It's nice to feel like, have somebody tell you you're doing a good job. It's nice to hear that, isn't it? It is nice. But it's also unnecessary here on earth. As hard as that is for us, it's unnecessary here on earth because when nobody is saying thank you or nobody's recognizing your good deeds, nobody's recognizing you for giving, you know who does? God. And He's the only one that matters. His recognition is the only recognition that actually really matters. Because His applause is eternal. His recognition and His approval is what is eternal. And His reward is forever. Because He notices and He stores for us a reward in heaven. And maybe, just maybe, it should be reward enough for us to know that God approves of what we've given or what we've done. If we go back to, I love this connection that's made here. If we go back to the end of verse 1, 6:1, the NIV says it this way, no reward from your Father in heaven. They'll get no reward. If you trumpet your own cause, you'll get no reward from God, from your Father in heaven. But probably a better translation is you'll have no reward with your Father in heaven. What Jesus is saying here is that if we do our acts of righteousness to be seen by men, then what we don't have is God, our Father, standing here beside us, looking on and seeing our acts of righteousness. We're not with Him. He's not with us when we're doing it to be seen by men. And I don't know about you, but I would rather have God looking on and seeing what I do than have man looking on and seeing what I do or what I give. So, I wonder, you know why I'd rather have that? You know why I'd rather have God looking on than man looking on? Because there isn't a reward in heaven for something that God isn't participating with or what He doesn't see. But what does God see and what does He experience with us? Giving is done in secret. Giving that is done in secret, not done for the little gold star that you get on your perfect attendance chart. A little gold star that tells you you've done a great job. And a little gold star that recognizes your accomplishment or your good deed right here on earth. What does secret mean? Because this is kind of an interesting concept. He begins to preach about doing things in secret, and yet what he taught just earlier in this same sermon, if you were to go back to chapter 5, verse 16, Jesus says, let your light shine before men, right? He says, let your light shine before men so that they see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So what is he saying here? Now he's saying, do it in secret, where before he said, let your light shine before men. I wonder, what does he mean here when he's talking about doing and giving in secret? I think what Jesus is addressing is the difference between heart motives, isn't he? I think what he's addressing is the right way for the right reason for the right reward that starts right here in our hearts. Again, it's a matter of who tells of your giving and who gets the credit. Right? Am I honored, or is God honored? That becomes, I think, the big question and reveals my true heart's desire when I give. You cannot hide your heart from God. We can't. As hard as we may try, and you can play the part of the hypocrite, the actor before man on your life stage, and you can fool man by wearing this mask of humility and goodness. But God sees the secret places. And when our giving is done from our secret place with a genuine heart for God's glory, then God sees it and He rewards generously His approval. So public and private giving, I think it's a heart issue. It's not whether people see it or don't see it. It's a matter of what does God see in our heart about the reason why we give, how we give, and for what reward we desire from giving. People are going to see what you've done, right? I mean, maybe even see sometimes what you give. But we should always want our Father in heaven's approval, not man's. We should always desire His honor and not our own. So when you give to those in need, this is a win. When you give to those you need, be careful to give in the right way for the right reason, for the right reward, which is simply this. It's to give out of the secret place of your heart with God's generosity for His glory, so that others will give testimony to His goodness. That's our reward. That's our reward.